All right, let's get started. So welcome everybody to Locked and Loaded, brief introduction on artillery IO. As I mentioned, I'm not an expert in artillery IO, but I started using it during my last project I'm working on, and I found it very easy to get started with, and actually pretty powerful. And it's open source right now. There's a free version. You can run it locally on your machine, but you can also run it in the pipeline. I'll touch on that briefly. There's also a professional version for artillery if you want to do distributed load in AWS or Google Cloud or Azure, where you can have different geographic locations. So that's the professional version. But I found the free version actually helpful. I've been doing, let me try to think, I think several thousand requests per second. The only thing that I would mention that you start seeing a warning about ICD, like over 75%, then I would a little bit be concerned about the results that you're having.
Hey Sven, I'm having a hard time hearing you here. I think Faith, I think you might have some feedback coming in from your phone.
I'm sorry, I thought I was on mute. I'm going to leave and rejoin it.
Okay, I think I can mute you. Okay. Okay, she's muted. All right, so Andrew, what do you want me to? How far did you get? What did you get, and what didn't you get? Or what was the last you heard?
We're good. It was really hard. It was cutting out pretty bad. So I heard some statistics being thrown around, but I couldn't really get anything out of it.
Oh yeah, so I was running tests over several thousand requests per second that I was doing, trying to see when our site would break, and I was getting like 75% CPU usage. And artillery was complaining the fact that there was a high CPU usage, and I was a little bit concerned about the results because my computer wasn't fast enough to generate the requests anymore. And what at that point might happen, I was talking to one of our CDS guys, is that if my computer doesn't get the response back from the server quickly enough, it might send the request again. Or if the packages are lost, it might send them again, and then you might basically send more requests than you intended to. And the server is starting to get problems on the backend because it's losing packages, and it has to gets additional requests and has to send additional responses. So be aware that if you hit on like high CPU usage, you might maybe think about having two machines running, or maybe run it as a Docker container in the cloud, not on your local machine.
Out of your experience, what's the best threshold where you would say good CPU usage should be?
I would say I noticed that it starts getting problematic around 70% CPU usage, but artillery will let you know when it has problems.
Okay.
It'll complain about a pit that is high CPU usage, and it will tell you which one it is, and that there is a concern.
Perfect.
Just throw a warning. All right, so the schedule for today is first I'll talk a little bit about sponsors and Testaholics in general. Then I'll talk about the why and how. Why do we do performance testing? Why did I pick artillery? What are some of the advantages there and some of the disadvantages? Bricks and mortars, we'll go a little bit deeper into the different section on how the test script is set up in artillery and what each of these sections mean and their purpose. And then time to get real is that we're basically go a little bit deeper in each of those sections, and I have individual performance scripts that kind of explain how that particular section is being used or that particular functionality is being used. And then what's next is basically just a list of some additional documentation that you can take a look at and what the upcoming Testaholics presentations will be. So let's real quick. So I want to thank tonight's sponsors, Slalom Build. And Slalom Build is a consulting firm specialized in delivering custom built technology solutions as a service. And it helps companies that kind of accelerate their digital transformation journey by blending in design, product engineering, analytics, and automation. We are always looking for good people. So if you are interested, then please reach out to either Karlin, myself, or just go to our website at slalombuild.com. Testaholics organizers at the moment, as I mentioned, Indira was one of the first ones, and then David and I kind of got involved, and now we also have an additional person, Karlin. If you are interested, if you want to reach out to us, have any questions about Testaholics or just any questions about any of the tools we have been discussing, or just questions in general, just reach out on LinkedIn, connect to us. We also have a Slack channel, and the information is later on in the slides. We have a LinkedIn page, and we have a meetup group, of course. All right, so Artillery.io, the why and how. So why performance test your code? I don't think I probably don't have to explain to people why to performance test your code. We all have heard the horror stories in the past about Black Friday or Cyber Monday, where sites would just go down because they couldn't handle the load that came in that day. We also have heard probably of the healthcare.gov that wasn't able to handle all of the people signing up for the Affordable Care Act. So those are some of the examples. I put a couple more links under there around some very well-known situations that led to either loss in sales, brand damage, lower conversion rates, and decrease of loyalty. So the definition, basically, performance testing is a practice to determine how a system performs in terms of responsiveness and stability under a particular workload. It can also serve to investigate, measure, validate, or verify any other quality attributes of the system, such as scalability, reliability, and resource usage. So the goals are kind of around response time. So how long does it take to load a page? How long does it take to get responses back from the API? You can also do like more functional ones, like placing an order or doing a search on your site and things like that. We also want to kind of look into scalability. So basically, how is our site performing right now? What would happen if we add additional resources like memory, or we add higher CPU? How would that impact performance? That's something we can measure so that we are ready for like higher traffic during like certain holidays, like and things like Thanksgiving or Christmas and Black Friday and things like that. We also want to check the stability of a website. So one of the tests is like endurance test or a stress test, where you would put a load for a longer amount of time. You can find out memory leakage. In the old days, we used to have like not very well working garbage collection, for instance, that could cause a problem over time. So we can kind of investigate that and see if that's the case. And we can also use it to check for availability. So one of the things that I don't think is done that often is like disaster recovery or outages, kind of like if you have a multi-server or service kind of architecture and one of your services go down or one of your containers go down, how is your site responding? How quickly is it able to auto scale or spin up those services again, or transition over to a different region if you have like AWS different regions? So you can test that as well. Here are a couple of the examples of a load test, different performance tests. Sorry, so the first one on the left, top left, is kind of load testing. So that's kind of to see what is your general performance. It's normally kind of a low amount of load over a short amount of time, like about an hour. So you can kind of see the impact of slower connections that might have on the system. So some of the tools kind of allow you to mimic a I was going to say dial-up user, but I don't know if there still exists dial-up users, but slower connections like 4G, 3G kind of connections to phones. And you can see if they have an impact on performance and what the performance would be on those devices, as well as the impact on other devices. Another one, endurance test, or sometimes also called soak testing, and that I use that one for like memory leaks to kind of see if there is a memory increase over time on one of your services that are running in the backend. Stress test is kind of like a capacity test, is to see how much traffic can you actually handle before your site goes down, or the impact on any of your backend services. And then peak test is to kind of see the responsiveness to like a certain increase in load. And that's kind of your typical Black Friday or Cyber Monday kind of test, or holidays where you might have a 10-time increase in load over a short period of time. Then the one that isn't on here would be like more like resilience or disaster recovery testing. So there you can kind of, as I mentioned, see how your site is able to handle outages or even deployments. Like a lot of us are trying to do blue-green deployments, but that's not always feasible. So also those services sometimes need some warm-up. So if you want to kind of see how that impacts your site performance, you can do something like that, where you kind of trigger auto scaling, or you bring down one of your services and see if your site is able to recover from that. Now, why Artillery IO? So Artillery IO was first introduced in 2016 by Hassi Veldstra. So before that, load testing was kind of the domain of the tester, of the manual tester, and they were using tools like JMeter. The JMeter at the time was very hard to containerize, so you couldn't really run it as part of the pipeline. So Hassi kind of was thinking about creating a load test tool, and at that time Node.js just came out, and YAML was pretty new at the time as well. So you want to have something that a developer could easily kind of work with, and that also the DevOps people, I think at that time they were called just operations, were able to easily embed in the pipeline. So he came up with Artillery, which is a very lightweight Node.js tool, has broad support right now. It can for different protocols, frameworks, and libraries. It works with HTTPS, WebSockets, IO, and some other methods as well. It's very easy to learn. It just uses a YAML file to set up your test. And then if you want to expand on it, you can use JavaScript to kind of have pre and post request modifications of any data you either submit or extract from your performance test. It's very extensible. There are a lot of libraries out there. As I mentioned, you can write your custom JavaScript methods. So you can basically, it's easy to learn, but you can do pretty complex things, and we'll go over that a little bit down the workshop. It has a pass-fail capability, so you could use it to double as a functional test. I don't know exactly why you would use a performance test as a functional test, but it allows you to, there's a plugin called Expect that allows you to do assertions. So you can do assertions, things like, I use it because one of our sites is supposed to redirect, or one of our endpoints is supposed to redirect. It has to throw a 302, so we'll check for that. But you can actually do things like make sure that it's returning JSON, make sure that it's running a certain property or field within the JSON, or a very specific response is being returned. And you can fail your performance test based on that. There's also things, a plugin called Ensure that allows you to do set thresholds. In version 1 of Artillery, they were very simple with things like maximum error rate and maximum duration. So you could say that the maximum response time would be 1 second, or your P90, which is like your on P95, which is a 95 percentile, should be under X amount of milliseconds. But with version V2 that came out recently, you can do more complex things, like you can use Boolean logic and stuff like that to kind of set up very specific thresholds that your test has to adhere to. Go ahead. Okay. So you can use that then to fail your test in a pipeline, your performance testing, and get notified when a change that was made to the code kind of impacts the performance of this. So I just want to kind of go over that a little bit more detail later, but if you do artillery run help, you can kind of see all of these options that you have. And these are all sections within the YAML file that you can override as part of your command line. So you can set the specific environment you want to run in, and that's kind of like a profile. So we'll discuss that a little bit, how you can use that. An environment could be, for instance, two different examples that I can bring up right now. An environment could be your different environments, like your dev environment, your QA environment, your UAT environment. But it could also be like more like a profile where you specify the phases or the load based on the environment. So you could do something like, I want to run my functional test. So I set it up that way that if I specify that profile, it would run pass and fail tests. And if I specify load, it would actually ramp up the load and keep it at a certain amount of time. And it would not carry so much about whether I get a 200 back, but more about what the performance would be of my site and maybe the error rates that I have. So I can use that in that regard. A nice one to do is the solo one, just quickly test. We'll just run one virtual user and run through your performance test to make sure that everything works fine. So you don't have to specify a specific phase for that, which I've been doing most of the time, but this is actually a nice way of testing it. And then targets and variables, we'll go over that more in detail. So next part is like, what does the artillery YAML file looks like? What does the script looks like? What are the different sections?
Go to your head.
What are each of those sections doing? So the first part is the config section, where you have the targets. So this is your base URL. So then you can use relative URLs later on in your test using your target. The client that I'm working on right now uses different URLs. So I'm testing an authorization application. So it has an identity service and a user service. And so I need to make calls to those different services. So I don't really use a target. But with the introduction of artillery 2.0, that target is actually required, but it can be just anything. TLS is the kind of disables certification validation. So if you have a self-signed certificate in your lower environment, you can say TLS equals false so that it doesn't validate that certificate. So you can run your test easily in the lower environments. You can also do that by providing a property or parameter -k that will also then ignore the certificates. And sure is why I was talking, where you can kind of use it to pass or fail your load tests based on specific thresholds, like error rate or minimum or maximum response times. Environment is kind of like I mentioned earlier, UAT production dev environment that can also use for different profiles. Variables, you can define inline variables that you want to use in your test, but you can also data drive it by using payload. Phases is your different load phases that you can define. Like we often see like a ramp up and then sustained kind of load and then maybe a ramp down. So you can specify those phases in there. You can also use a pause phase where you don't have any traffic going. A plugin section is where you can extend your performance test using a host of different plugins, or kind of also write your own plugin, your own JavaScript extension. Sorry, that's the processor. So now I'm mixing the two up. So plugins would be the plugins for assertions would be one of the plugins, or there's another plugin to have fuzzy data, or there's a plugin to collect information about the performance of individual endpoints. There are quite a few. So I have a list later in the presentation. I think I'm going to show some code here. Just to quickly demo this part. So if I look at one of the more complex ones. So this is your, yeah, this is slightly different. So I got a phase in here, so I can name my phase so that later when I run my performance test, I can see when it's switching phases and how long these phases are. It kind of gives you that information. The duration is in seconds, how long you want that phase to last for. And then we have things like arrival rate and arrival count and next user. So arrival rate will generate X amount of virtual users per second. And there's no max set. So if you say it's 5 virtual users per second, so that means that 5 users will start the scenarios, your performance test basically every second. If the whole test takes less than a second, then that means that there's going to be less or equal to 5 concurrent users. But if it takes more than a second, then your concurrent users keeps going up. So you can kind of control that by saying max V users. That kind of specifies how many concurrent users you can have in system. So let's say that you set it to 10, and your arrival rate would be 5, but it takes about 5 seconds to go through each scenario. That means that you would have 5 the first second, 10 the second, 15 seconds the third second. But if you set max V users, then that would be kept at 10 concurrent users. So this arrival rate would then go up and down to just keep you at 10 concurrent users. RAM2 would be used in connection to arrival rate. That's kind of if you want to do your ramp up. So let's say you have an arrival rate of 2 and you have a RAM2 of 10 and a duration of 10 seconds. That means over 10 seconds, it will go from 2 to 10 users. Your ramp up. Arrival count is a fixed number of virtual users of the duration of the phase. So if you have arrival count, I'll just give an example of 10. So duration of 10 seconds, arrival count of 1,000, that means that it would be about 100 requests per second. So 100 scenarios are being run of 100 users that are starting the test per second. Yeah, I think I went through all of it. The second section, so your first section is like your config, where you kind of have your variables, your phases, your environments, your payload files, your processor files, so everything that needs configured to the snare is actually your actual test. So again, it has a name. You can name your individual scenarios, so that will show up in a reporting. It's more like a user-friendly name then that you can use instead of the endpoint. The weighing, that's kind of, let's say that you will want to have 10% of your users doing searches and 90% of your users creating uploading an image, for instance. You can do that with weighting. This is kind of like 80%, in this case 80%, but this is not necessarily in percent. So if you do 8 to, it would be 8 times as many this one, 2 times the other flow. So the flow kind of outlines the scenario functions, allows you to run JavaScript functions, either pre or post or as part of your request. The URL specifies the endpoint that you want to run your request against, which in this case is like a relative one. If you use a target, you can use relative URLs. Otherwise, you can also have fully qualified domain names in here, or you can set up the URLs as variables, or so it can be pretty flexible. Headers, any header information about cookies and things like that, what kind of information you expect or what kind of information you're sending. QS stands for query string parameters. So these are your things like if you want, like what you see in your pad, your question mark, and then the parameters equals and then the value. So it's a kind of key value pair that you kind of would put that into. Form is kind of if you use a form fields in your request. JSON would be a JSON body. Expect is kind of like your assertions around things like you expect it to 100 back, or you expect to, what is being returned to be a JSON, or you expect that the JSON to have a specific property in there. And captures is how you kind of collect information out of the response in an easy way. You can also do that with your JavaScript functions. And logging is kind of used to help you more like around debugging. It's kind of being outputted in your output window when you run the test. So in this case, I'm just making sure that I actually got a token back when I do my authorization call. As I mentioned, you can data drive your test using payload. So sections in here are the path, which has to be a relative path with the version 2.0 of Artillery. Before that, you could use absolute paths. So that's no longer the case. So keep that in mind. So this specifies an external CSV file, comma separated file. And you kind of specify the different fields, which is the different columns. So they don't have to be the same. Your CSV file can or cannot have a header column. If you have a header, then you can say skip the header. Otherwise, it's going to try to use that information and pass along into the test. And then you can pick either a random order within your CSV file, or you can just go through them by sequence. You can have more than one. Like for instance, this one will have credentials for my users, and this one will have some information for my booking, like the check-in, check-out times and stuff like that. Let's see. Oh yeah, there's some additional things that you can set, like a delimiter. If you don't use comma delimiter, you can specify what your delimiter character is within your CSV file. Skip empty lines. By default, it will skip the empty lines. I don't know. I've never tried it to see what it would do when I don't skip the empty lines. I guess it just will use null values for that. And then cast by default, it will kind of convert to the native types. So it will recognize integers and booleans and strings, but you can overwrite that if you want to. We talked a little bit about pass and fail tests. So functional testing, you would use like the expect. So you can do things like I mentioned, status code, content type, the properties within your JSON that's being returned. And if you want to run it in the pipeline, you can use like thresholds. So this is the version 1 kind of thing that was very simple. You could a max of 1 second. So if your response takes more than a second, it will fail your performance test, or if in this case, if it has more than 10% error rates. With version 2.0, it's a little bit more complex, but you can do things. You can do still the same thing. So here it was max or P99 or P95. You would put in here, and then you set what that value should be. Now you can specify different values for different ones, and you can also have conditions. So you can write pretty complex expressions for your CICD. This is an example on how to embed it into Jenkins and run as part of your pipeline. So you basically just pull in a Docker image, a Docker image. This is just to make sure that it's not running as the commands as your Jenkins user, but rather as a root, and that there's no entry point set for your Docker container. And then you basically, this is necessary. You have to create that folder if you want to store like your reports. And then you just run basically, and we'll go over that later. This is the run command to run and to output actually your results of your performance test into a JSON file, and then you can convert that JSON file into an HTML file. We'll go over that a little bit later. And this kind of just exports to that directory so that it's accessible within your Jenkins pipeline. So it exports this out of the container. I put a link in there. So just click on it. So there's examples for Jenkins, but you have Azure, AWS, GitLab, GitHub Actions. So there are quite a few different examples on how to integrate it with your CI/CD pipeline. Okay. So what do you need to start artillery? So Node.js, put a link in here. I'm using a Windows, but you can download Node.js. You can use npm if you have a Mac. You just download the latest Node version. In my examples, I'm using Visual Studio Code, and I'm just using npm to install the latest version of artillery. You can specify the version you want to. And then this is the repo. Okay, and then all it takes basically is this simple, oops, I can't do this. This simple command line. So what it does is quick means you don't are using a YAML file. A C means a count of, hold on. So that's the fixed number, that's like the arrival count, so the fixed number of users that you're going to use, and is the number of requests for each of those arrivals. So this is basically gonna start 15 users, and they're gonna run this request 30 times. So they're gonna search for Testaholics Anonymous. And with that, I'm going to switch over to the repo. Stop sharing here, and I'm going to share my other screen. Can you everybody see my screen?
Yep, we see you.
All right, is it large enough, or do you need to increase the font?
I think it's okay.
Okay. So I just copied that thing real quick, so that artillery quick, so it's gonna run. It has no phases defined, so I'm just gonna use unnamed. So basically, this is the response after my load test. So it did. So going every 10 seconds, it will spit out a report, and then at the end of the run, it will finish that as well. So 20 seconds, and it's done. So it did 450 requests, 23 requests per second total. This is the minimum, the fastest response time. The maximum response time was a little bit less than a second. And the medium and your 95 percentile and your 99 percentile. So you get 450 responses back. It's the amount of users that it used, 15. And then these are the session lengths, because I did everything 30 times. So that's your basic report. So start with scaffolding. So we have our target specified in here, and we're going to use this particular example, which is going to return the gender of the person that I'm searching for. And as I mentioned, this is a get call. We're just going to use this target URL right now, and we're going to put in the query parameters, name equals David. So if we run this one, so basically artillery run and then the location of the script. Again, this has not really any phase defined. So it just gives me a response, but I can't really see what is going on. So if I want to see what's going on, I kind of have to put in logging, or I can also put in debugging. And that's slightly different between a Mac, I think I put it in here, between a Mac and a Windows machine. But so this is a Windows machine I'm using right now. I can say debug. If I want to do debugging, I do HTTP, and I want everything, so I just do a star. if I run my test now again, it should kind of give me the request and responses that it's doing. So now I got a little bit more information. So if I have a problem with my test, I can easily kind of see this. So this is the request that it did. So the URL, the method, the headers it put in, query parameters, and this is the response that I received. So I can see that the response was returned the name of David, gender of male, probability of that being 99%. So that's that. If I want to turn it off, I just basically set to the button nothing. If I run it again, I now have my original output again. So that's my scaffolding. That's the minimum I need to basically run my test if I use a YAML file. So as you saw, nothing is really being returned. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to capture what we saw in the debug statement. We had information about the probability. We had the name in there, the gender. So we basically had a section called capture. We specified that the response is a JSON, and we're looking for a field, a property called probability, and we're going to call that response probability. And same thing for gender, we're going to call that response gender. And then we added a log file saying that there is a text in one change that David is a, when you run this particular thing, so this is our response. That's a 0.99 in one chance that David is a male. All right, next one, we're going to play around with some variables. So we're going to use some inline variables. So what we want to do is we kind of want to use a variable called first name, and we'll do the same thing. So and the variables, we can do inline ones in here. So we specified a property called first name, and we added 3 different names to it. And then we're going to run this. We created a face this time. There's no name yet, but it's going to say unnamed, but we're going to run it for 3 seconds and then arrival rate of 1. So we're going to do 1 user every second for 3 seconds. So, oops. Oh. So minus Q is quiet. It will not return any output. There we go. And I think I got a bug. So what happens if you don't see anything? There's most likely a bug in your code. So let's take a look, and we see that first name is lowercase f, capital N. So we had a bug in our code. Let's fix that.
You set the debug to empty?
Say what?
Didn't you set your debug environment variable to an empty string?
I did. You
want to set that back to true?
Oh, and then leave the bug in there.
Yeah.
You want to see what it? Okay, let's roll back my fix. Okay, so this before was fixed. So we'll see that missing name parameter. You can see that. So it basically just submitted this because I wasn't able to substitute the variable for the actual value.
Do you have to put, I think you have to put a space between those curly brackets and your value, right?
You don't have to.
No? Okay.
Let me fix the problem. It makes it a little bit easier to read if you put a space in there. I agree. If I now turn off this debugging. So now we got, oops. Let's run this with the Q one so it doesn't give me all that additional information. So now we see that there's a 63% chance that Dan10 is a male. You can figure out Dan10, I guess. 52% that Karlin is a female, and 99% that Sven is a male. Now we captured that information and we used the variable. So next, I'll fix this one. I'll push it up later. So let's do the same thing with the CSV. So we basically have a section payload. We identify the path, it has to be relatively, and then we define the fields. So we have a first name and last name. Now I'm gonna make sure that first name, last name, okay. Correct capitalization. And our CSV file is one step up in the resource folder. So resources, names. So this is my CSV file. I got quite a few names in there. And I have a header one, first name, last name. Let's make sure that we skip our header. Skip header through, order is random. We ran this for 5 seconds with a arrival rate of 3, so we're doing 3 users per every 5 seconds. So now we got quite a few in there, and if we run this again, make sure that it's random. So first one was Edwin, Roland, so now it's Danielle, Francis. So it's picking those values randomly out of my CSV file. We saw that this one says a 0.99 in one chance. So this is actually something that's being returned by the response body. So let's kind of create a function that instead of, hold on, is this one? We actually kind of convert that 0.99 into percentage. So it's a very simple function. But now, so I added this. So we still have if our CSV file that we're using, order of random, skip level through processing, you identify where our helper functions are. So this is in the utility folder. Helper function, and the helper function we are going to use after our response. So you have a before response, you have an after response, or you can just use the word function. Then you can call it anytime. But if you want to do they're slightly different the way that they are being set up, the signature of the method. So if you look here, this was percent calculation, if I'm correct. Percent calculation. So percent calculation, basically, this is your request. So you can do whatever things with your request if you want to do it. This is a post request one, but so this is the request information. This is the response information. The context in which your test is running, so you can access the variables in there. These are events. If you want to do something with events and interact with the artillery directly, and next is just to basically make sure that you are continuing your test. So we basically grab the JSON body, so by REST body, and we parse it, and then we are grabbing this probability one and multiply that by 100. That's a simple function. So, and we are running this function after the response, and we're using this variable probability that we defined in here. This is an example on using a JavaScript function library and method in your test. So now instead of 0.99, that we get basically multiplied by 100. So we get now it says 99%. So a very simple example of how you can use JavaScript functions within your performance test.
Very
Moving
cool.
on, moving on to weighing. So this is a test that 80% of the time it will use the name in Peter, and 20% of the time it uses the name Ken. So now we're going to actually create a report to kind of see how the names are being used and the weighing, and to verify that the weighing is actually correct. Now the weighing is going to be not perfectly 80 for like smaller durations. The longer your duration is, the more likely it will be nicely 80-20 distributed. In our case, I don't want to stress that that endpoint, so we're just going to run it for 100 seconds at 1 request per second. And then in this case here, we will be outputting into a JSON file underneath the report folder. Here's my reports folder. Only has this one thing in there. So that's the -o or dash -o or dash output you can use for the longer name. So you'll see that we now in our space we use the name, so we'll see the name in here as well. We still have Q, which is quiet, so there won't be any intermittent reports or performance information shown in our output. It also tells you, so it's done. So it tells you the duration is 100 seconds. Oh no, hold on. What? Oh, I didn't run with -Q. Okay. If you would run with -Q, this would not show up. Now there's a very nice report viewer that someone created that is currently being reviewed for version 2, because version 2 had a couple of breaking changes and has not been approved yet, but I think I have the link in the presentation, because this one is it's a very basic report that Artillery creates. And here you can see the user's Peter Pan. So this is a 4.6, not completely 2080. Okay, that's done. So here's the reports file. And so if you want to run the report, it's as simple as artillery report, and then you specify the location of your response file. And there's also a bug in this one, I just noticed. It's .json, but there's no .json. So it just report weighing. So we'll fix that. So artillery report and then the location of your JSON file. That will generate a report. So there's a report that I just created. Oops, and it's opening up on screen. This is what the report looks like. So you see it's not exact 80-20. It's getting close. The longer you run, the more like closer it will get to 80-20. You got 66 runs for Peter and then 24 for Pam. This is your chart. I'll go over that a little bit later. I'm not a big fan of these charts. But yeah. I will show you what it did. But basically, this is the load. So assertions. So I mentioned earlier that I'm not using it that often because I don't want my test to fail necessarily if I don't get the expected result. Like this is more if you want to do like a functional test. I think I have a more. I think I have a better example later, unless I deleted it accidentally. But basically, we used a plugin called expect, and then we can use that to check things like status code, content type, property one. In this case, I want to make sure that my JSON that's being returned has a property of gender. And it will actually show you the results. So it will tell you the endpoint that it called, which is just to get one here, and then whether or not it passed or failed. So I change something here and it says I cannot expect data to be returned as a property file. I don't know, it doesn't make sense. First name. Oops, did not save it. So now you'll see that it did fail the test. So technical difficulties here. Why is it not? I show you that it failed and that it does not have a first name property in there. So then it basically will give me additional information about what actually was returned. So I can see, oh yeah, there's no first name in there. That's how you use expect and assertions. This one I just added this morning. This is looping, so you can do more complex things. An example was a simple way we need to generate 1,000 users, and I thought, okay, I'll use a performance script to generate 1,000 users. And we had one thing where they logged in, and then we looped 1,000 times through the method to create a user. So that's an example that you could use. So in that case, you basically have a loop and a count one. So instead of 5, I could also use a variable in there. So I can define my variable based on the phases or just an inline variable that is defined in my config file, or maybe something that comes out of CSV file. And that will kind of determine how often I run this particular call. And then you can actually exit the count, but keep in mind that this is a zero-based count. So it will say 0 to 4 if I run this test. You can do more complex one. You can say while true, and then you can use a JavaScript function where you calculate something that you maybe a response that you're getting back, but you need to wait until something is in a certain state or a certain amount of users being created. For instance, it could be another thing, or while you don't get an error, keep going, making this request. So there's some more complex things you can do. So this are kind of like the step-by-step instruction for each of the individual pieces that we discussed in the config and in the scenario section. So if you want to go into a little bit more complex ones, I have a few that I created in the test. So the sandbox one is for you to play around with. There's some bugs in it that you can fix. Let's do the weather one. So this is kind of using a couple of things that we kind of discussed in the past. We have our target here, which is our base URL. We're gonna not validate the certificate of that site. We're gonna put some performance in there that our maximum response time should be a second. and we don't want our test should fail if we have more than 10% errors. We're using inline variables for the city names. So we have a couple cities in here. But we'll use a warm-up phase where we run for 5 seconds. We run one user every second, arrival rate. Then we're gonna ramp up our load. We're gonna go from 2 users per second up to 5 users per second over the time of 10 seconds. And then we're gonna run a sustained load for about 1 minute with 5 users. And you notice I keep this on purpose low because this is not really a site to do performance testing against. It's just an API site that I found. So we are using a helper function. And for the helper one, let's see, do we have a... Okay, I look like I removed it. I don't have test data. Oh, it might be somewhere else in another test that I did that. We'll go over that. We have an expect, so we're going to make sure that our status code is 200 that we get back. And then we're going to extract some data around the region, the weather condition, and the current temperature. And then we're going to log that. So you'll see it shows me the current phase, and it will show me the results. Sun in Chicago right now, 68 degrees. It's finished my warm-up. It's going to my ramp-up. It's going from 2 till 5 users over the course of 10 seconds. There, and then I'm still getting my reports every 10 seconds. If I don't want that, again, -Q will remove that output. And it looks like I might be getting timeouts. So I'm stressing the site a little bit too much and it's not responding anymore. So yeah, so I wasn't able to handle my load, so I'm not getting timeouts. But it's kind of an example on the different kind of sections that we went over with this step-by-step instructions. And it's responding again. Okay, so my sustained load is done. So that should be the end of my test. So I didn't create a report where I can now see that I got 332 timeouts. I got 19,200 responses, and you can see that it took about a 1.5 second. Some checks for status codes. And I got failures. My test failed. If you run this in a pipeline, this should give you a failure. It's an example of using profiles. So in this case, what I did is, again, not checking for valid certificates. I have my maximum time, my error rate. So here I got my environments, but I'm hold on, let me. So maybe this one is a better example. Oh, so here the difference, I have a dev environment and I have a test environment. In my dev environment, I only have one phase. I'm just using one user for 1 second. and I have these two variables. So, and then in my test environment, I have a warm-up, 2 users for 2 seconds, a ramp up like I had before, but then for 4 seconds I go from 2 to 10 users, and then sustained load, and I have a couple more people in here. I put in everybody that signed up earlier today. So here I'm collecting information by endpoint, and I have my percent calculation again for the probability. So that's one example. You can kind of, for different environments, have different load volumes or durations or whatever you want to do. But maybe this one is a good example. This is a more complex one where we are using a booking site. But in here, I kind of use, instead of having environments as different test environments, I'm actually using it to either do load testing or functional testing. So I got a load environment where I run it for 60 seconds with 3 users per second. I kind of commented this one out, but I could have different thresholds that I set up for my load test. I'm just using the simple one for maximum of 1 second. And so these are still accepted in version 2 of Artillery. They're not being phased out yet. It's to be backwards compatible because these were the ones that people use the most. So I'm using them V1, but these are examples if you want to use the more complex ones that are available in version 2 of Artillery. And then I have another environment that I call functional, where I just run once through my performance test, and I'm actually using expect. And you'll see that in my calls here, I have an expect where I'm checking the status code of 200 in JSON and booking ID. If I don't load that plugin as part of my configuration, like in the load test, it will not do those expect. It will just ignore them. So it won't throw an error message. So you can have assertions in your test, but not actually run them unless you specify that you want to run the assertions by yeah, adding that expect into your config. But this one has 2 different payloads. So it uses a file to hold my credentials, my username and password. And then there's another file, the old book information. So my test, this is very simple. I just have one admin password, 123. And my booking information is, it's like some random data, like whether or not the deposit was paid, when I'm checking in, when I'm checking out, if I need anything else, like additional information, and what the total price of my booking is. So my test, and I'm also using a function file. So my test is, here I'm using a before, and some people are familiar with that from their end-to-end testing, where you have a before each or before all. So this will run this particular flow and request basically once before my test starts for my user. So that's the before thing, and then all I'm doing here is getting a token that I'm using if I want to delete a booking or if I want to update a booking. I need to be authenticated. I need to have a token. So this one will generate a token for my user, and then I can use that token later in my test. And my scenarios, I'm creating a booking. I'm using a function called test data. If you're looking into here, test data will basically just use Faker to create a first and last name, and I'm using that in my test. So yeah, I'm importing the Faker library, and then I can use that within my JavaScript method. The URL is booking. This is my token that I created or got, basically, and then specify the content type and what I expect. So first, I'm not going to do this just in the lack of time, but this is like a hard-coded example, and this is kind of an example pulled from my CSV. This section is pulled from the CSV, and this is from my JavaScript function. And then we expect, so if I do run my functional test, it will actually run these assertions. It will get my booking ID. It will get then that booking ID that I just created. And I will make sure that the first name that is being returned from my booking is actually the same as the first name that I used to create that booking. So I'm doing some assertions in here that it equals first name and last name. Then I'm going to update that booking. Oh, I'm just changing the first name and last name to Testaholics Anonymous, and then I'm going to validate that that was changed to Testaholics Anonymous, so that my update was successful. Then I'm getting all of the bookings by name, so I'm going to search for Testaholics Anonymous. So that would be only one for that first run, if I only have one user per second. This will export how many bookings I've found if I want that information, and then so I'm gonna grab all of the bookings that are found. I'm gonna use the first one of the list that's being returned, and I'm gonna update that one again. That's the Testaholics Anonymous, and then validate that it was successful. And I guess that's all I did. If I want to run the functional test, I used E in there. E stands for environment. So that's the environment that I specified up here. You can either do -- environment, or you can just do -E. So this is going to use the information contained within this part of the config section. Oh, sorry. This one, functional. So it's going to do the assertions. Let's make that so it run through it once. Basically, all the ones that had assertions, it's going to say whether or not they passed. So this was originally Trevor McClure, and then we changed it into Testaholics Anonymous. And then we grabbed the list of one. I didn't output how many we have, but that information would be helpful as well. But this is basically my functional test. So my functional test passed. And I can run the same thing, my load test. This time I'm going to create a report. So -O to export the data into the folder reports, and then in TA complex, so the link to my test, and -E is now going to pick the environment called load. So it's going to be slightly different now. Now it's going to use different phases. I'm going to do C. So start the load test. So I only have this one. Start load test, duration of 1 minute, and it's going to do 3 users, starting 3 users per second. Let's finish. This is my last report. So it did 900 requests. All of them returned 200s, 15 requests per second. This is my response times. So I guess I would be most interested in the response times, or I can actually just get the response times also per endpoint. That would probably be more useful here. I'll see which one of my endpoints is kind of the slowest one, or the takes the longest amount of time. And for that, so this is the plugin that you can install to get metrics by endpoint. Let's try that and see. Don't know where I got it. Hold on, I'm gonna look and see if I have this information. I'm correct. That should not really expecting. Now the problem is because this is in the path, so it's gonna per booking is gonna create my. I would not say it's probably not necessarily what I want. That's the nature of this particular endpoint is that it has the ID specified in the path, so it sees it as a separate endpoint. Hopefully your website is a little bit better created where you use a query parameter. Anyway, so that was created. So to create a report would be just something artillery report and the location of the file. Report. So the report is generated here in the report section. 551. Let's see that everything was successful, no errors. And then here are your different endpoints. Unfortunately, this is kind of really hard because of the patterning, but you can kind of see the response time. That's kind of reporting that it gives you. All right, and that's all I had for the hands-on work. So let me quickly stop sharing and share the rest of the presentation. So what's next? So I just added a couple of links to kind of gives you more information on how to install artillery, how to use artillery, what are the different methods and different abilities that Artillery has, the plugins, the GitHub location, which is kind of interesting. It shows you some of the endpoints, ensure some of the different plugins that they have. These are all the GitHub repos. One thing I want to highlight is that for
Sven,
yes,
we're not seeing your screen.
Oh, okay. Sorry. So here's a list of all of the links to give you a little more information about Artillery, the different sections that I went over, HTTP references and the plugins. So I was just looking at basically so the different repos they have for the plugin expect, some examples that they have, how to integrate it with the Playwright. See, the other thing that I did is in the repo itself, when I was talking about the step-by-step instructions, I added a link to the actual. I did this morning, realizing that I really should have some documentation that actually explains this a little bit more. So all of these kind of are going to the different sections within Artillery IO. So if you go to Artillery, basically go to documentation, and then underneath the reference, so here it talks a little about the description, the different sections. I explained the target, load phases. There's some examples in here. In HTTP reference, you can see but the reject unauthorized, what I was using a lot. Make sure if you have self-signed certificates. You can look things for like loop. This is how you use loops. I went over that, and you can go into more complex one. Not sure where exactly, but I believe they have some information about how to use while true. Go to variables. So I put in the links within the repo itself, but you can basically find everything in here.
Very helpful. Thank you, Sven. I noticed that you guys, or it's probably you, but you started a organization, Testaholics, for the repo. I was wondering, maybe I can share that last repo that I presented for Cyprus. I can share that with you as well.
Yeah, that would be awesome. And I think I did one on TerraTest. I want to move that in there as well, because I think I have it in my local right now. But we'll start putting all of the information in here that we use as part of our presentations. So
Very
let me make sure that you do have access to this repo. I'll add you to it.
Perfect, thanks. And then I just wanted to say, I haven't used it, but I know the hot topic that came across my lap was Artillery and Playwright. Being able to use both of them together.
Yeah, let me. So here's an example how you can run it, run it basically.
Yeah.
Yeah, I know Playwright, and I'm hoping we can do a presentation around Playwright pretty soon. This is one of the cool new tools out there. So if any of you on the call has experience with Playwright, please reach out. That's all I have for today.
Thank you so much, Sven. It was very interesting and I learned a lot, and I'm sure everyone did. My question is more from process perspective. When, in terms of like, we have worked in agile models, right, with testing, and how early does it make sense to introduce or plan for this kind of testing? With end-to-end test and other tests, I know we are able to, and of course, unit tests and all kind of come earlier in play. At what stage, at what percentage of completion of the product does it make sense to say that now we are ready for, introducing this test?
So I know that performance testing often in the past has been like more like an afterthought, like the site is ready, now let's see if it actually performs. And then we found issues, and then we had to kind of identify where the bottlenecks were. And it becomes a little bit harder because when your site is ready, that probably a lot of services in the background that kind of interact with each other. Finding out where exactly the bottleneck is. If it's on database level, is one of the services that is waiting for another service. Is maybe not enough connections to the database and things like that. So it makes it really hard to kind of debug. So my recommendation is to start on the APIs and do some performance testing on the APIs. I've been kind of recommending that to my developers. They don't like it as much. They want me to do more like a functional kind of performance test. So what I've been doing is kind of use my functional API tests to do things like logging into my application, creating a case. I'm working on a government project at the moment, but it's like creating a case for something and kind of create a functional API test and then a load test that so there are less services that I need to monitor to see where the bottlenecks are. But I would start with it early enough when you have like APIs that you can performance test.
That's nice. So let's just say, I have an API ready for to be able to test in Scope UI or Postman. While the UI is still being developed, once I'm able to do the basic check with Postman, that is a good time to be able to, use this plugin and test, right?
Yes, if you can hit it with Postman, you should be able to also hit it with artillery.
Yeah, that sounds like a good plan. And the second question was just follow up of what you just said, that we start at the API level. How far can we take it and build up on it? Is it not going to be worth the return of effort versus return of investment when we kind of introduce it on a end-to-end basis, like when the whole system is ready? Would it not be a good good test to run at that time, or would it still have high return of investment?
It would still be you can start stringing more things together at that time, because you can then test more like a real life scenario where certain people would be doing certain things. Because if you're doing only like your API, that's not a real world use of that API in isolation. Like for instance, if you have we have, for instance, in my example, is a user service that's being used when you authenticate to our application. So it checks and makes sure that that user exists. So it hits that user endpoint. But then later on, that user endpoint is also used when people are searching for users, for instance, or when a particular user, as I mentioned earlier, is creating a case, then that user data is being collected again. We are creating a case for a specific user, for instance. So then that endpoint is called again, but in a totally different scenario. So then now your login, people logging in might actually impact the performance of someone that is creating a case and is also dependent on that endpoint. So I would then start creating more and more complex scenarios and then use weighing to kind of mimic what the load is in your production environment. So I don't know if you use things like New Relics or Splunk or some logging information that can give you some data around how often that endpoint is hit per second. And then you can kind of look at the different workflows throughout your application and create some load tests around those workflows, and then identify how many people are doing a particular thing within your site, and then use weighing.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you. Like there are multiple applications and it may not be just one endpoint. Like I have in my end-to-end flow, I kind of So it probably API endpoints sound like a good place to start. And since end-to-end kind of becomes a little challenge with load testing, because it's not just the page load function, it's a lot of other things which kind of come in play, including CPU usage on the machine and other things. So I've been trying to explore different options because that is more similar to how our traders in production kind of use these things, and with respect to the fixed exchange server for financial information exchange and other things. But I am actually pretty glad to hear that it's something which we can build upon at different API levels, because it kind of travels to different places in the tech stack. So even if we can't do it at the endpoint which the end user sees, maybe we can do it just before that, what we see, and compare that with the actual statistics which we have, and see that where we are from there. And from your own experience, have you been able to use it on a live product? And I mean, how much of feedback was, how was it able to, give you feedback in terms of what changes were needed to be able to tell the development team that, this is what is happening and these are the things which we need to change, or these are the improvements which we need to do?
Yeah, when we were running our load test, so we have an application that uses it's like an API gateway, and underneath it there are two different services: the identity service and the user service. And we noticed that when we were logging in, we were starting to get errors on the API gateway. But then digging into it, it looked like the user service was a little bit slow to respond. So the API was keeping the transaction open and it was running out of, what do you call those? Connections, I guess. Connection pool was getting a little low. And so we had to kind of increase the connection pool. We also noticed that we kind of had to scale up the user service, so we increased the memory. We ran the test again. That looked like it was a little bit better, but we then added another service to it. So instead of running one service, we were running two services, and then we noticed that it was actually the issue was resolved. So we were able to kind of make that change based on the load testing we did in a lower environment. Did it answer your question?
Sorry, I was on mute. Yeah, that does. Thank you so much, Sven. So I think those were the questions which I had, and if I have more, I know how to reach you. So
yes, that's right.
Sven, I have a question just more about like approach of load testing, right? Because Dira mentioned putting it into end-to-end, and I've never really thought of load testing like that. I thought it was always, used as a tool to like exploratory test with load testing. But I want to know your thoughts on perhaps putting it in a pipeline end-to-end.
So to be honest, so we haven't done that with artillery yet in the pipeline, but we are planning to do it in Jenkins. We're just trying to get approval to kind of spin up another Docker container. But it would be good to kind of, I think pass and fail is one thing, but where would your thresholds be? I would be more interested to see if it has increased compared to the previous run. So if there's all of a sudden there was a change made, and instead of having a 1.2 seconds response time, all of a sudden it became 2 seconds response time, that would be a red flag for me. So I would not necessarily use thresholds, but I would use more like an increase, substantial. I don't know, I wouldn't call it a substantial increase, but I wouldn't say that only be concerned if it doubles in time, but if there is a large increase in, and you kind of have to define what that specifically means, but a 10% increase in production performance would be a concern. That's why I want to kind of run the APIs to see if any of the response of the APIs is changing when they are making changes to the underlying code within the API. So that would be my interest. I would not necessarily use thresholds like a 2-second one.
Yeah, good points. Because I think that obviously will stop your running. So yeah, I kind of have some own of my struggles with load testing, just because our client wants to load test with functional tests. So we actually are running full-on Selenium tests, right? And so part of this is gathering the results. So instead of having somebody else's graphs or analytics that I can point to or whatever, I'm kind of collecting that data on my own side. We can feed it to Splunk or something like that, not a problem, but we need to be able to deliver a report basically to the end customer. And they love to think about these nice fancy graphs of how beautiful it might be to get all of these types of metrics. And JMeter kind of builds all that in where it just, you run some JMeter tests, their graphs are actually somewhat decent just out of the box. And you said that you didn't really feel that way with artillery, that you didn't like their graphs. So
I look more at the raw data that's being returned. Like,
yeah,
what does
so
95th percentile look like? My outliers, not so much interested in, but more like 95th would be my basic metric to go off.
yeah, no, I'm curious about that. I wonder if there's some other type of, components or plugins or something that you can extend it with.
So there's the report viewer. Hold on, let me see. So it hasn't been approved yet for version 2, but I can give you. So it turns out that the guy that created the report viewer, I wasn't aware of that. I'm not sure, is he online? No, he's not here. But he actually sent me a link to the new version of it that he's currently trying to get approved for Artillery 2.0. Let me see. Go to my email real quick.
Yeah, I just found it. Report viewer beta.
Yes, so he sent me a different link. It's called AIOreportviewer.com. If you find report viewer beta, is that the repo? Are you able to access the repo?
Oh, yeah, it's public, I guess.
Okay, so maybe it just got approved. It's still like beta kind of thing. But basically, there's also a website where you can go to, but I don't think the website is up yet because it's still in beta. But if you have access to the repo, you can download the repo and you can spin up the service yourself, and then you can basically put your JSON file in there. And that one does give a really nice report.
Cool.
I don't have an example of it right now, but
Here, I'll share it in the chat.
okay. Oh, okay. I'll share the URL that he gave me. I know that the previous version of report viewer was not compatible with version 2.0. I've been trying to download the latest version. There seems to be an issue with Node. I think you have to downgrade Node in order to get it to work, but he was working on getting it updated so it works with Artillery 2.0 and the later Node version. But yeah, that's a nice report viewer.
That's cool.
And welcome. I noticed you moved to Portland.
Yeah. So yeah, I moved to Portland, went to work for another company, and yeah, now I'm here.
To have you.
What's that?
Great to have you.
Yeah, thanks. Just so everyone else on the call knows, I used to work with Sven at Slalom, and yeah, it's pretty cool. pretty interested in actually using this over at where I am now at Flow Route.
You found it helpful.
Yeah.
All right. Anyone has any more questions? Otherwise, we'll call it a day. The only other thing that I wanted to mention, so we don't have a topic for May at the moment, but let me hold on, let me share my screen again one more time. The next one we have right now is June 16 is API testing using Postman and Newman. And then July 14 is currently load testing using Gatlin. And I think in August, we have a workshop around API testing, and it's going to be a longer one. That's probably going to be over the weekend, like 4 hours. That's all we have for today.
Thank you very much for giving the talk.
Welcome, and I hope to see you all during our next presentation or workshop or roundtable.
Thank you so much, Sven. It was great seeing you, and thank you for the presentation.
Welcome. Good to see you, Indira.
Yeah, good to see you. I'll catch up with you offline.